Hey there, fellow philosophy enthusiasts, ready to dive deep into some really fascinating stuff. We're going to explore someone and something that I think will really get those philosophical wheels turning in your mind.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about Isaac Polqar, a Jewish Averroist.
Right, and like we always do, we're going to try to get a really solid understanding of this guy's philosophical framework, what he's all about, and how it all fits together.
That's right. So we'll be looking at how Polqar engaged with Averro's ideas.
And we'll also look into how he defended Judaism, especially against criticisms from his old teacher, Abner of Burgos, who actually ended up converting to Christianity.
And we can't forget the main philosophical debates that were happening during his time, which is the late 13th and early 14th centuries.
Right, and a big part of Polkar's thinking, or at least something that really stuck with him, is the belief that Judaism and true philosophy, like real philosophy, don't clash. They actually go hand in hand.
Yeah, and that belief is kind of going to be our guide as we explore his work and his ideas.
Okay, so before we get too deep into the philosophical weeds, can you give us a little background on Isaac Polqar himself? Who was he? Where did he live? And what kind of work did he do?
So Isaac Polqar was doing his thing in northern Spain during the late 13th and early 14th centuries.
Okay, that's a pretty interesting time period. Lots going on.
Yeah, definitely. And he wasn't just a philosopher either.
Oh, really? What else was he known for?
He was a pretty well-respected scholar, especially when it came to the Bible and the Mishnah.
Wow, so he was a real scholar, not just an armchair philosopher, huh?
Yeah, you could say that. He was also a poet and even worked as a physician.
No kidding! A true Renaissance man before the Renaissance even happened.
Exactly, a true polymath. And the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Polqar mentions that we've unfortunately lost a lot of his work over the centuries.
Oh, that's always a shame, especially when you know there's so much we could have learned from him.
Right, and it makes you wonder what kind of insights we're missing out on. We know he wrote commentaries on Genesis, Ecclesiastes, and the Psalms.
That must have been quite something, especially considering his expertise in both philosophy and religious texts.
Absolutely. And he also wrote things like Instruction of the Sons, Epistle on Hope, and even a refutation of astrology.
It sounds like he was incredibly prolific, covering a lot of ground, but we do have some of his work still around, right? Like what gives us a real window into his thinking?
Right. We have a couple of key works that survived. There's A Response to the Heretic, which was, like you said, a direct response to his old teacher, Abner.
And then there's his main work, In Support of the Law.
Yes, exactly. That's his magnum opus. And another really important thing he did was finish Isaac Albalig's Rectifying the Opinions of the Philosophers.
Wow, so he was picking up where others left off and really contributing to the ongoing philosophical discussions of his time.
Totally. And it's in these texts that we really see his sharp mind at work, especially in his back and forth with Abner of Burgos.
Right, so let's talk about that relationship a bit more, because it sounds like it really shaped Polkar's intellectual journey, especially after Abner became Christian.
Oh, absolutely. It's a central conflict for Polqar, and it really highlights how he defended Judaism.
And it all goes back to that idea we talked about earlier, that true religion can't clash with basic philosophical truths.
Precisely. And for Polqar, that was the foundation of his arguments against Christianity, as Abner was putting it forward.
So how did Polqar tackle Abner's arguments, particularly on the philosophical level? It sounds like a pretty complex issue to unravel.
So he strategically identified three core philosophical ideas, which he said were like non-negotiable.
Oh, so these were the things that, in his view, any true religion absolutely had to align with.
Exactly, and they were. God exists, God is absolutely one, and God doesn't have a physical body, he's not made of matter.
Okay, so no physical form, purely spiritual, that kind of thing.
Yeah, in philosophical terms, they call that incorporeality. It means God exists purely as spirit or intellect, not in any physical form.
Got it. So God is pure thought or consciousness. And Polkar's argument was that Judaism upholds all three of these principles, but Christianity, with its ideas of the Trinity and the Incarnation, contradicts the last two.
Right. He saw those Christian doctrines as basically saying there's kind of multiplicity in God, and also that God took on a physical form in Jesus.
Which, to Polqar, went against the whole idea of God being purely spiritual and beyond the physical world?
Exactly. And he argued this very strongly, especially in response to the heretic and in his big work In Support of the Law.
Now, Abner, being a former Jewish scholar, wouldn't have just rolled over and accepted these arguments. How did he try to bridge that gap between these two seemingly opposing views?
Well, he did some interesting things, even drawing on Jewish sources to support the Christian side.
Oh, so he was trying to say that even within Jewish tradition, there were hints of these Christian ideas.
Exactly. One example is how he interprets a midrash on Psalms 50.1.
For those who might not know, what's a midrash?
A midrash is basically a kind of commentary on the Hebrew Bible, written by rabbis. It often involves storytelling and interpretation, drawing out deeper meanings from the text.
Okay, thanks for clarifying. So, what was this midrash about, and how did Abner use it?
So in this passage, God is called by three different names: El, YHVH, and Elohim.
Okay, and what did Abner do with that?
Well, he connected each of these names to a different divine attribute, like wisdom, understanding, and knowledge.
Interesting. So 3 names, 3 attributes. I see where this is going.
And then he linked these to the Christian Trinity, basically saying wisdom represents the Father, understanding is the Son, and knowledge is the Holy Spirit.
That's a pretty creative connection, I have to admit.
And to make his point even stronger, he used ideas from Aristotle, particularly the active intellect, to try to give a philosophical basis for the Trinity.
Hold on, can you break down the active intellect for a second? It sounds like a crucial concept here.
Sure, in Averroes' philosophy, the active intellect is this universal, non-physical intellect that's the source of all human reason. It's like the ultimate source of knowledge and understanding.
Okay, that makes sense. So Polqar, being an Averroist, would have been very familiar with this idea.
Exactly, and he saw engaging with this active intellect like a really important part of intellectual and even spiritual growth.
Got it. So Abner used this concept to argue that intellect, the act of knowing, and the object of knowledge don't have to mean there are 3 separate things numerically.
Right, so he was saying that even though there are different aspects of God, they can still be part of a single unified God, kind of like how different aspects of the active intellect don't mean there are multiple intellects.
That's a clever way to try to reconcile those ideas.
Yep.
How did Polqar respond to that specific interpretation of the Midrash, or did he focus more on the broader principle of God's unity being violated?
Well, Polqar mainly stuck to his guns on the whole idea of God's unity being absolute.
So, regardless of how Abner tried to explain it, for Polqar, any kind of division within God just wasn't acceptable philosophically.
Exactly. He might have offered different ways of understanding the Midrash, but his core argument was that saying there are separate persons in God goes against that fundamental unity, which is like a cornerstone in philosophical theology.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about the incarnation? That seems like another huge point of contention between the two. How did Abner defend that concept, and how did Polqar counter it?
So Abner basically said that the incarnation was necessary, especially for things like the existence of individual beings, the soul being immortal, and the whole idea of reward and punishment in the afterlife.
Okay, so pretty big concepts there, things that matter a lot to both Judaism and Christianity.
Yeah, he linked the incarnation to how God actively participates in creating individual things in the world.
So the idea is that without the incarnation, God wouldn't be directly involved in creation, and therefore things like the soul's immortality or divine justice wouldn't have a solid basis.
Right. Abner saw it as God stepping in, taking an active role in the world in a really specific and necessary way.
Okay, I can see how that makes sense from his perspective. But Polqar saw the incarnation as a direct contradiction of God's essential incorporeality.
Yeah, he thought that God taking on a human form just didn't make sense philosophically. For him, it went against the fundamental principle about God's very nature.
It's interesting how they're both working within a shared framework of philosophical ideas, but coming to radically different conclusions about what those ideas mean for religious belief.
Yeah, it highlights how philosophy can be used to support very different viewpoints, even when using the same basic concepts.
Okay, so we've talked about God's unity and the incarnation. What other major areas of disagreement did Polqar and Abner have?
Well, they had some pretty heated debates about the authority of the Talmud and the Jewish sages.
Right, I guess that makes sense, since Abner was trying to argue for Christianity from a Jewish perspective.
Exactly. And he went so far as to say that the sages who compiled the Talmud actually kind of agreed with Christian doctrines, but couldn't say so directly.
Oh, that's a bold claim, trying to find hidden Christian messages within the Talmud itself.
Yeah, it's pretty audacious. He would take certain passages from the Talmud and say they hinted at Christian beliefs.
So he's reading between the lines, interpreting those passages in a way that supports his argument.
Right, and he even suggested that the sages were being intentionally obscure in their teachings.
Interesting strategy, but I can see how that would rub Polqar the wrong way. How did he respond to this kind of interpretation?
Well, he emphasized the importance of the oral law, which is what the Talmud embodies, in understanding and interpreting the written Torah.
So he's emphasizing the traditional Jewish way of looking at these texts.
Exactly, and he pointed out the historical context of when the Talmud was compiled, saying it was a way to preserve Jewish tradition during exile and persecution.
That makes sense. During times of upheaval, you want to safeguard your traditions and ensure they're passed down accurately.
Right, and Polqar also argued that the Talmud has different layers of meaning. Some parts are meant to be taken literally, while others are more esoteric or allegorical.
So he's saying there's more to the Talmud than meets the eye. You can't just take everything at face value.
Exactly, and he argued that non-legal rabbinic texts, they call it Gaddic texts, only really carry weight if they agree with sound philosophical principles.
So he's bringing philosophy back in as a kind of measuring stick for evaluating these texts.
Yes, and he accused Abner of basically twisting interpretations to fit his Christian agenda. He said Abner wasn't being genuine in his approach to these Jewish sources.
So it's not just about disagreeing on the interpretation, it's about accusing Abner of using those sources in a manipulative way.
Right, he felt Abner was cherry-picking and misrepresenting what the Talmud really said.
This tension between how to interpret religious texts, especially when you're talking about a figure like Abner who converted to another religion, is really fascinating. How did Polqar see the relationship between the Torah and the Talmud in terms of their authority?
He actually created a kind of hierarchy, putting the Torah of Moses at the top as the ultimate source of truth, with the Talmud serving as an interpretive layer below it.
Okay, so the Torah is the foundation, and the Talmud helps to explain and apply its teachings.
Exactly. But he wasn't one to just dismiss people who thought Talmudic stories were just fables.
So he didn't think all those stories were literally true.
Well, he acknowledged that they weren't always meant to be taken literally. He said they were a way of teaching knowledge and ethical lessons to people who might not be able to grasp more complex philosophical ideas.
So he saw them as having pedagogical value, even if they weren't historically accurate. It's kind of like how you might use a story to illustrate a point, even if the story itself isn't true in the literal sense.
Right, exactly. It shows how he was trying to balance reason and tradition, acknowledging that sometimes you need different approaches to reach different audiences.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but there's one more big issue we need to address. The Messiah. This was obviously a major point of contention between Jews and Christians at the time. How did Polqar approach this question, and how did it play into his arguments with Abner?
So this question of whether the Messiah had already come was a huge deal, and it was something they debated through interpretations of Scripture and rabbinic texts.
Right, because you can't just settle that kind of question purely through philosophical logic. You have to look at what the texts themselves say and how they've been interpreted over time.
Exactly. So the debate focused on whether the prophecies about the Messianic era had really happened, particularly in relation to Jesus.
Okay, so they were both trying to fit historical events into a framework of prophecy and interpretation. How did Polqar argue that the Messianic era had not yet begun?
He pointed to several messianic prophecies that he thought hadn't been fulfilled yet.
So he's looking at the prophecies and saying, look, these things haven't happened, so the Messiah can't have come yet. What specific prophecies did he use?
Well, he talked about Ezekiel's prophecy about the Israelites permanently returning to their homeland.
Okay, so the idea that the Jewish people would eventually all be back in their land.
Right. And then there's the prophecy about the war of Gog and Magog, which was supposed to happen right before God shows his ultimate favor to Israel.
That sounds pretty apocalyptic.
Yeah, definitely a big end times kind of event. And then there's Amos's prophecy about Jerusalem and the third temple being rebuilt.
So for Polqar, these weren't just minor details. They were key events that needed to happen before the Messianic age could truly begin.
Exactly. He saw them as major contradictions that ruled out the claim that Jesus was the Messiah.
And for Polqar's Jewish audience, living in exile and witnessing the ongoing struggles of the Jewish people, these unfulfilled prophecies would have resonated deeply.
Absolutely. It would have been a very powerful argument for them, especially since they were experiencing firsthand the reality of those unfulfilled prophecies.
Okay, so what about Abner? I imagine he had some counter-arguments to all of this. How did he try to fit those prophecies into his Christian understanding of history?
As you might expect, he tried to apply those same prophecies to the Second Temple period. and to interpret Jesus' arrival as the start of a new messianic era, one where Christian beliefs were established.
So it's a classic case of two different interpretations of the same texts, with each side trying to show that their reading is the most consistent and historically accurate.
Precisely. And it highlights how deeply rooted these debates were in the interpretation of Scripture and how much weight those interpretations carried.
Okay, so shifting gears a bit, let's move on to another major philosophical issue that Polqar and Abner clashed over: determinism and free will. It's a topic that philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries, and it gets even more complicated when you bring God's omniscience into the picture.
Absolutely, it's a tricky subject. If God knows everything, past, present, and future, then where does that leave human choice? Are we really free to make our own decisions, or are we just playing out a script that's already been written?
Right. It raises the question of whether we have genuine agency or whether we're just puppets on a string. And there's a spectrum of positions on this issue, from hard determinism, where everything is predetermined, to libertarian free will, where we have complete control over our choices.
Exactly. And Polqar fell somewhere in between. He rejected the idea of radical determinism when it came to human actions.
So he didn't believe that everything we do is preordained, that we have no real choice in the matter.
Right. He thought we had some degree of freedom, but it wasn't absolute. He was trying to find a way to balance human freedom with God's knowledge and power.
So how did Abner approach this issue? Did he lean more towards the deterministic side?
He did. He argued that because God has perfect knowledge of everything, humans can't truly have free will.
So his argument is that God's complete foreknowledge makes genuine human choice impossible.
Exactly. He saw those two things as fundamentally incompatible. If God knows what you're going to do before you even do it, then how can you be said to have a real choice?
That's a pretty tough argument to counter. How did Polqar address that challenge?
He had a few different lines of argument. First, he drew on Maimonides' ideas, emphasizing that God's knowledge is different from human knowledge.
So we can't just assume that God thinks and knows the same way we do.
Right. He argued that it's a category mistake to compare the two directly. God's knowledge is infinite and perfect, while ours is finite and limited.
So we can't impose our human limitations on how God knows things.
Exactly. And he also introduced this fascinating concept of God desiring possibility.
What does that mean exactly?
It's like saying that when God created the world, he built in the potential for human choice. It's as if God wanted there to be genuine freedom in the universe, even though he knows everything that will happen.
So it's not just that God allows for free will, it's that he actively wants it to exist.
Right, and that's a pretty unique way of looking at it.
It is, and it seems to suggest that God's knowledge isn't just about knowing what will happen, but also about creating a space where things can happen in multiple ways.
Exactly. It's like saying that God's knowledge encompasses all possibilities, not just the one that will actually play out.
Okay, that's a pretty mind-bending concept. Did Polqar have any other arguments about free will?
He did, and this is where it gets even more interesting. He argued that true free will mainly belongs to intellectuals.
So people who are really smart and thoughtful have more free will than others?
It's more nuanced than that. He's saying that those who really cultivate their intellect and use their reason are more free than those who are driven by instinct and desires.
Okay, so it's not just about being smart, it's about using your intellect to guide your actions.
Right. It's about actively engaging with your rational faculties and making choices based on understanding and reflection.
So he's suggesting that the more you understand, the more free you become. That's a pretty interesting perspective.
It is, and it raises some questions about the nature of reason and freedom.
Like, if intellectuals are following the dictates of logic and reason, are they really choosing freely, or are they just following where their reasoning leads them? It seems like a bit of a paradox.
It is, but I think Polqar's point is that acting in accordance with reason is the highest form of freedom because it involves conscious deliberation and choosing what you believe is true and good.
So it's not just about doing whatever you want. It's about aligning your actions with what you understand to be right and rational.
Exactly. And that kind of freedom is more fulfilling and meaningful than just acting on impulse or desire.
Okay, I can see how that makes sense within his framework. But I imagine Abner had something to say about this idea. How did he challenge Polqar's notion of intellectuals having more free will?
Well, he argued that if material things like the stars don't influence the intellectual soul, then maybe other non-material things could.
So he's saying that if it's not the physical world that's determining our choices, then maybe it's something spiritual or supernatural.
Exactly. He brought up the idea of separate intelligences or spiritual beings that might be pulling the strings, so to speak.
So he's not ruling out determinism entirely, just shifting the source of that determination from the material world to the spiritual realm.
Right, and this is where Polqar had to clarify his position.
Okay, so how did he refine his argument in response to Abner's challenge?
He said that he only rejected material or physical influence on the intellectual soul.
So he's saying that our minds aren't controlled by physical forces.
Right, but he did accept the influence of the active intellect.
Oh, so that universal intellect we talked about earlier is still in the picture.
Yeah, and he said that this influence depended on how much someone studies and engages with intellectual pursuits.
So the more you learn and think, the more you open yourself up to the influence of the active intellect.
Exactly. And he saw that as a positive thing because he believed the active intellect was a source of truth and goodness.
So it's not about being controlled by a spiritual being, but rather about being guided by a higher intellect that helps you to understand the world and make better choices.
Right. And he thought that through intellectual engagement, we could become more aligned with that higher intellect and therefore make freer and more rational choices.
Okay, that's a pretty subtle distinction, but it's important to understand how Polqar was trying to navigate these complex ideas.
Definitely, and it shows how he was trying to reconcile philosophical concepts with his religious beliefs.
Okay, so we've talked about God's knowledge, the active intellect, and how all of that relates to free will. Did Polqar offer any final arguments on this topic?
He did, and it involves a distinction he made between human will and what he called natural will.
Okay, so what's the difference?
He said that natural phenomena, like the weather or the movement of the planets, operate in a deterministic way, always following predictable patterns.
So they're governed by laws of nature that dictate how they behave.
Right. But human will, he argued, has a unique ability to choose between different options.
So we're not bound by the same kind of predetermined patterns as the natural world.
Exactly. He believed that we have a capacity for genuine choice that sets us apart from inanimate objects and even from other animals.
That makes sense. It wouldn't make sense to say that a rock has free will, or even that a dog makes choices in the same way humans do.
Right, and he argued that if you deny free will, you blur the lines between things with souls and things without souls.
So you're essentially saying that everything is the same, that there's no fundamental difference between a human being and a rock.
Exactly, and he thought that was a dangerous idea because it diminishes the unique value and dignity of human beings.
It also seems to undermine the whole idea of morality and responsibility if our actions are predetermined.
Absolutely. If we're not truly free to choose our actions, then how can we be held accountable for them?
Right. The whole concept of ethics seems to depend on the idea that we have at least some degree of freedom to make choices.
Precisely. And I think that's a key part of why Polqar was so committed to defending the idea of free will.
Okay, so to sum up Polqar's stance on free will, he basically argued that the future isn't set in stone, that the intellectual soul has genuine freedom, and that there's a fundamental difference between how our minds work and how the natural world operates.
Yes, that's a good summary. He tried to find a middle ground between absolute determinism and absolute freedom, acknowledging the influence of both God and the active intellect, while still maintaining that we have a real capacity for choice.
It's a pretty impressive attempt to reconcile some very challenging philosophical and religious ideas. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the thought of Isaac Polqar, can you remind us of the main goals he was trying to accomplish with his work?
So his project had three main parts. First, he wanted to defend Judaism against criticisms from Christianity, especially those put forward by Abner.
Right. That was a major focus for him, especially given his personal relationship with Abner.
Exactly. And second, he was a big champion of Averro's ideas within Jewish thought.
So he was trying to show how Averro's interpretation of Aristotle could be reconciled with Jewish beliefs and practices.
Right. He saw Averroes as the most accurate interpreter of Aristotle, and he thought that his ideas could enrich and deepen Jewish philosophy.
And third, he had to defend his own philosophical interpretations against other Jewish thinkers who might have been more traditional or skeptical of philosophy.
Yeah, he was facing challenges from both outside and inside the Jewish community.
It sounds like he was navigating a pretty complex intellectual landscape.
He was, and there's evidence that he might have even used what scholars call esoteric writing, which means he might have hidden some of his more radical or controversial views to avoid getting in trouble.
So he had to be careful about what he said and how he said it, given the social and political climate of the time.
Absolutely. He was walking a tightrope between reason and faith, tradition and innovation, and he had to be strategic in how he presented his ideas.
Okay, so as we conclude our exploration of Isaac Polqar, it leaves us with a lot to think about, especially in terms of how he tried to harmonize philosophy and religion.
It's a timeless challenge that many thinkers have grappled with, and Polkar's efforts offer valuable insights into how we might approach that challenge in our own time.
So for our listeners out there who are interested in exploring these ideas further, here's a question to ponder. How do we navigate the complexities of reason and faith in our own lives? And what lessons can we learn from figures like Isaac Polqar, who attempted to bridge that divide centuries ago?
It's a question that's worth reflecting on, and it's one that continues to resonate with us today as we search for meaning and understanding in a world that's often filled with contradictions and uncertainties.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the thought of Isaac Polqar. We hope it sparked your curiosity and given you some new perspectives to consider. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking wisdom wherever you can find it.